Part 3. The Production of Absolute Surplus Value. Chapter 7. The Labor Process and the Valorization Process. Section 1. The Labor Process. The use of labor power is labor itself. The purchaser of labor power consumes it by setting the seller of it to work. By working, the latter becomes in actuality what previously he only was potentially, namely labor power in action, a worker. In order to embody his labor in commodities, he must above all embody it in use values, things which serve to satisfy needs of one kind or another. Hence, what the capitalist sets the worker to produce is a particular use value, a specific article. The fact that the production of use values, or goods, is carried on under the control of a capitalist, and on his behalf, does not alter the general character of that production. We shall therefore, in the first place, have to consider the labor process independently of any specific social formation. Labor is, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature. He confronts the materials of nature as a force of nature. He sets in motion the natural forces which belong to his own body, his arms, legs, head, and hands, in order to appropriate the materials of nature in a form adapted to his own needs. Through this movement, he acts upon external nature and changes it, and in this way he simultaneously changes his own nature. He develops the potentialities slumbering within nature and subjects the play of its forces to his own sovereign power. We are not dealing here with those first instinctive forms of labor which remain on the animal level. An immense interval of time separates the state of things in which a man brings his labor power to market for sale as a commodity from the situation when human labor had not yet cast off its first instinctive form. We presuppose labor in a form in which it is an exclusively human characteristic. A spider conducts operations which resemble those of the weaver, and a bee would put many a human architect to shame by the construction of its honeycomb cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is that the architect builds the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. At the end of every labor process, a result emerges which had previously been conceived by the worker at the beginning, hence already existed ideally. Man not only effects a change of form in the materials of nature, he also realizes his own purpose in those materials. And this is a purpose he is conscious of. It determines the mode of his activity with the rigidity of a law, and he must subordinate his will to it. This subordination is no mere momentary act. Apart from the exertion of the working organs, a purposeful will is required for the entire duration of the work. This means close attention. The less he is attracted by the nature of the work and the way in which it has to be accomplished, and the less therefore he enjoys it as the free play of his own physical and mental powers, the closer his attention is forced to be. The simple elements of the labor process are 1. Purposeful activity, that is, work itself, 2. The object on which that work is performed, and 3. The instruments of that work. The land, and this economically speaking includes water, in its original state, in which it supplies man with necessaries or means of subsistence ready to hand, is available without any effort on his part as the universal material for human labor. All those things, which labor merely separates from immediate connection with their environment, are objects of labor spontaneously provided by nature, such as fish, caught and separated from their natural element, namely water, timber felled in virgin forests, and ores extracted from their veins. If, on the other hand, the object of labor has, so to speak, been filtered through previous labor, we call it raw material. For example, ore already extracted and ready for washing. All raw material is an object of labor. But not every object of labor is raw material. The object of labor counts as raw material only when it has already undergone some alteration by means of labor. An instrument of labor is a thing, or a complex of things, which the worker interposes between himself and the object of his labor, and which serves as a conductor, directing his activity onto that object. He makes use of the mechanical, physical, and chemical properties of some substances in order to set them to work on other substances as instruments of his power and in accordance with his purposes. Leaving out of consideration such ready-made means of subsistence as fruits, in gathering which a man's bodily organs alone serve as the instruments of his labor, the object the worker directly takes possession of is not the object of labor, but its instrument. Thus nature becomes one of the organs of his activity, which he annexes to his own bodily organs, adding stature to himself, in spite of the Bible. As the earth is his original larder, so too it is his original tool house. It supplies him, for instance, with stones for throwing, grinding, pressing, cutting, etc. The earth itself is an instrument of labor, but its use in this way, in agriculture, presupposes a whole series of other instruments and a comparatively high stage of development of labor power. As soon as the labor process has undergone the slightest development, it requires specially prepared instruments. Thus we find stone implements and weapons in the oldest caves. In the earliest period of human history, domesticated animals, i.e. animals that have undergone modification by means of labor, that have been bred specially, play the chief part as instruments of labor, along with stones, wood, bones, and shells, which have also had work done on them. The use and construction of instruments of labor, although present in germ among certain species of animals, is characteristic of the specifically human labor process, and Franklin, therefore, defines man as a tool-making animal. Relics of bygone instruments of labor possess the same importance for the investigation of extinct economic formations of society as do fossil bones for the determination of extinct species of animals. It is not what is made, but how, and by what instruments of labor that distinguishes different economic epochs. Instruments of labor not only supply a standard of the degree of development which human labor has attained, but they also indicate the social relations within which men work. Among the instruments of labor, those of a mechanical kind, which, taken as a whole, we may call the bones and muscles of production, offer much more decisive evidence of the character of a given social epoch of production than those which, like pipes, tubs, baskets, jars, etc., serve only to hold the materials for labor, and may be given the general denotation of the vascular system of production. The latter first begins to play an important part in the chemical industries. In a wider sense, we may include among the instruments of labor, in addition to things through which the impact of labor on its object is mediated and which therefore in one way or another serve as conductors of activity, all the objective conditions necessary for carrying on the labor process. These do not enter directly into the process, but without them it is either impossible for it to take place or possible only to a partial extent. Once again, the earth itself is a universal instrument of this kind, for it provides the worker with the ground beneath his feet, and a field of employment for his own particular process. Instruments of this kind which have already been mediated through past labor include workshops, canals, roads, etc. In the labor process, therefore, man's activity, via the instruments of labor, effects an alteration in the object of labor which was intended from the outset. The process is extinguished in the product. The product of the process is a use value, a piece of natural material adapted to human needs by means of a change in its form. Labor has become bound up in its object. Labor has been objectified. The object has been worked on. What on the side of the worker appeared in the form of unrest now appears on the side of the product in the form of being, as a fixed, immobile characteristic. The worker has spun, and the product is a spinning. If we look at the whole process from the point of view of its result, the product, it is plain that both the instruments and the object of labor are means of production, and that the labor itself is productive labor. Although a use value emerges from the labor process in the form of a product, other use values, products of previous labor, enter into it as means of production. The same use value is both the product of a previous process and a means of production in a later process. Products are therefore not only results of labor, but also its essential conditions. With the exception of extractive industries such as mining, hunting, fishing, and agriculture, but only insofar as it starts by breaking up virgin soil, where the material for labor is provided directly by nature, all branches of industry deal with raw material, i.e. an object of labor which has already been filtered through labor, which is itself already a product of labor. An example is seed in agriculture. Animals and plants, which we are accustomed to consider as products of nature, may be, in their present form, not only products of, say, last year's labor, but the result of a gradual transformation continued through many generations under human control, and through the agency of human labor. As regards the instruments of labor in particular, they show traces of the labor of past ages even to the most superficial observer in the great majority of cases. Raw material may either form the principal substance of a product, or it may enter into its formation only as an accessory. An accessory may be consumed by the instruments of labor, such as coal by a steam engine, oil by a wheel, hay by draft horses, or it may be added to the raw material in order to produce some physical modification of it, as chlorine is added to unbleached linen, coal to iron, dye to wool, or again it may help to accomplish the work itself, as in the case of the materials used for heating and lighting workshops. The distinction between principal substance and accessory vanishes in the chemical industries proper, because there none of the raw material reappears in its original composition in the substance of the product. Every object possesses various properties and is thus capable of being applied to different uses. The same product may therefore form the raw material for very different labor processes. Corn, for example, is a raw material for millers, starch manufacturers, distillers, and cattle breeders. It also enters as a raw material into its own production in the shape of seed. Coal both emerges from the mining industry as a product and enters into it as a means of production. Again, a particular product may be used as both instrument of labor and raw material in the same process. Take, for instance, the fattening of cattle, where the animal is the raw material and at the same time an instrument for the production of manure. A product, though ready for immediate consumption, may nevertheless serve as raw material for a further product, as grapes do when they become the raw material for wine. On the other hand, labor may release its product in such a form that it can only be used as raw material. Raw material in this condition, such as cotton, thread, and yarn, is called semi-manufactured, but should rather be described as having been manufactured up to a certain level. Although itself already a product, this raw material may have to go through a whole series of different processes, and in each of these it serves as raw material, changing its shape constantly until it is precipitated from the last process of the series in finished form, either as means of subsistence or as an instrument of labor. Hence, we see that whether a use value is to be regarded as raw material, as instrument of labor, or as product is determined entirely by its specific function in the labor process, by the position it occupies there. As its position changes, so do its determining characteristics. Therefore, whenever products enter as means of production into new labor processes, they lose their character of being products and function only as objective factors contributing to living labor. A spinner treats spindles only as a means for spinning, and flax as the material that he spins. Of course, it is impossible to spin without material and spindles, and therefore the availability of these products is presupposed at the beginning of the spinning operation. But in the process itself, the fact that they are the products of past labor is as irrelevant as, in the case of the digestive process, the fact that bread is the product of the previous labor of the farmer, the miller, and the baker. On the contrary, it is by their imperfections that the means of production in any process bring to our attention their character of being the products of past labor. A knife which fails to cut, a piece of thread which keeps on snapping, forcibly remind us of Mr. A, the cutler, or Mr. B, the spinner. In a successful product, the role played by past labor in mediating its useful properties has been extinguished. A machine which is not active in the labor process is useless. In addition, it falls prey to the destructive power of natural processes. Iron rusts, wood rots. Yarn with which we neither weave nor knit is caught and wasted. Living labor must seize on these things, awaken them from the dead, change them from merely possible into real and effective use values. Bathed in the fire of labor, appropriated as part of its organism, and infused with vital energy for the performance of the functions appropriate to their concept and to their vocation in the process, they are indeed consumed, but to some purpose, as elements in the formation of new products, which are capable of entering into individual consumption as means of subsistence or into a new labor process as means of production. If then, on the other hand, finished products are not only results of the labor process, but also conditions of its existence, their induction into the process, their contact with living labor, is the sole means by which they can be made to retain their character of use values and be realized. Labor uses up its material elements, its objects, and its instruments. It consumes them, and is therefore a process of consumption. Such productive consumption is distinguished from individual consumption by this, that the latter uses up products as means of subsistence for the living individual, the former as means of subsistence for labor, i.e. for the activity through which the living individual's labor power manifests itself. Thus, the product of individual consumption is the consumer himself. The result of productive consumption is a product distinct from the consumer. Insofar, then, as its instruments and its objects are themselves products, labor consumes products in order to create products, or in other words, consumes one set of products by turning them into means of production for another set. But just as the labor process originally took place only between man and the earth, which was available independently of any human action, so even now we still employ in the process many means of production which are provided directly by nature and do not represent any combination of natural substances with human labor. The labor process, as we have just presented it in its simple and abstract elements, is purposeful activity aimed at the production of use values. It is an appropriation of what exists in nature for requirements of man. It is the universal condition for the metabolic interaction between man and nature, the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence, and it is therefore independent of every form of that existence. Or rather, it is common to all forms of society in which human beings live. We did not, therefore, have to present the worker in his relationship with other workers. It was enough to present man and his labor on one side, nature and its materials on the other. The taste of porridge does not tell us who grew the oats, and the process we have presented does not reveal the conditions under which it takes place, whether it is happening under the slave owner's brutal lash or the anxious eye of the capitalist, whether Cincinnatus undertakes it in tilling his couple of acres or a savage when he lays low a wild beast with a stone. Let us now return to our would-be capitalist. We left him just after he had purchased, in the open market, all the necessary factors of the labor process, its objective factors, the means of production, as well as its personal factor, labor power. With the keen eye of an expert, he has selected the means of production and the kind of labor power best adapted to his particular trade, be it spinning, bootmaking, or any other kind. He then proceeds to consume the commodity, the labor power he has just bought, i.e., he causes the worker, the bearer of that labor power, to consume the means of production by his labor. The general character of the labor process is evidently not changed by the fact that the worker works for the capitalist instead of for himself. Moreover, the particular methods and operations employed in bootmaking or spinning are not immediately altered by the intervention of the capitalist. He must begin by taking the labor power as he finds it in the market, and consequently he must be satisfied with the kind of labor which arose in a period when there were as yet no capitalists. The transformation of the mode of production itself, which results from the subordination of labor to capital, can only occur later on, and we shall therefore deal with it in a later chapter. The labor process, when it is the process by which the capitalist consumes labor power, exhibits two characteristic phenomena. First, the worker works under the control of the capitalist to whom his labor belongs. The capitalist takes good care that the work is done in a proper manner, and the means of production are applied directly to this purpose, so that the raw material is not wasted and the instruments of labor are spared, i.e. only worn to the extent necessitated by their use in the work. Secondly, the product is the property of the capitalist, and not that of the worker, its immediate producer. Suppose that a capitalist pays for a day's worth of labor power. Then the right to use that power for a day belongs to him, just as much as the right to use any other commodity, such as a horse he'd hired for the day. The use of a commodity belongs to its purchaser, and the seller of labor power, by giving his labor, does no more, in reality, than part with the use value he has sold. From the instant he steps into the workshop, the use value of his labor power, and therefore also its use, which is labor, belongs to the capitalist. By the purchase of labor power, the capitalist incorporates labor as a living agent of fermentation into the lifeless constituents of the product, which also belong to him. From his point of view, the labor process is nothing more than the consumption of the commodity purchased, i.e. of labor power, but he can consume this labor power only by adding the means of production to it. The labor process is a process between things that the capitalist has purchased, things which belong to him. Thus, the product of this process belongs to him just as much as the wine which is the product of the process of fermentation going on in his cellar. Section 2. The valorization process. The product, the property of the capitalist, is a use value, as yarn, for example, or boots. But although boots are, to some extent, the basis of social progress, and our capitalist is decidedly in favor of progress, he does not manufacture boots for their own sake. Use value is certainly not the thing desired for its own sake in the production of commodities. Use values are produced by capitalists only because and insofar as they form the material substratum of exchange value, or the bearers of exchange value. Our capitalist has two objectives. In the first place, he wants to produce a use value which has exchange value, i.e. an article destined to be sold, a commodity. And secondly, he wants to produce a commodity greater in value than the sum of the values of the commodities used to produce it, namely the means of production and the labor power he purchased with his good money on the open market. His aim is to produce not only a use value, but a commodity. Not only use value, but value, and not just value, but also surplus value. It must be borne in mind that we are now dealing with the production of commodities, and that up to this point we have considered only one aspect of this process. Just as the commodity itself is a unity formed of use value and value, so the process of production must be a unity, composed of the labor process and the process of creating value. Let us now examine production as a process of creating value. We know that the value of each commodity is determined by the quantity of labor materialized in its use value, by the labor time socially necessary to produce it. This rule also holds good in the case of the product handed over to the capitalist as a result of the labor process. Assuming this product to be yarn, our first step is to calculate the quantity of labor objectified in it. For spinning the yarn, raw material is required. Suppose in this case 10 pounds of cotton. We have no need at present to investigate the value of this cotton, for our capitalist has, we will assume, bought it at its full value, say 10 shillings. In this price, the labor required for the production of the cotton is already expressed in terms of average social labor. We will further assume that the wear and tear of the spindle, which for our present purpose may represent all other instruments of labor employed, amounts to the value of 2 shillings. If then 24 hours of labor, or 2 working days, are required to produce the quantity of gold represented by 12 shillings, it follows first of all that 2 days of labor are objectified in the yarn. We should not let ourselves be misled by the circumstance that the cotton has changed its form, and the worn-down portion of the spindle has entirely disappeared. According to the general law of value, if the value of 40 pounds of yarn equals the value of 40 pounds of cotton plus the value of a whole spindle, i.e. if the same amount of labor time is required to produce the commodities on either side of this equation, then 10 pounds of yarn are an equivalent for 10 pounds of cotton together with a quarter of a spindle. In the case we are considering, the same amount of labor time is represented in the 10 pounds of yarn on the one hand and in the 10 pounds of cotton and the fraction of a spindle on the other. It is therefore a matter of indifference whether value appears in cotton, in a spindle, or in yarn. Its amount remains the same. The spindle and cotton, instead of resting quietly side by side, join together in the process. Their forms are altered and they turn into yarn. But their value is no more affected by this than it would be if they had simply exchanged for their equivalent in yarn. The labor time required for the production of the cotton, the raw material of the yarn, is part of the labor necessary to produce the yarn, and is therefore contained in the yarn. The same applies to the labor embodied in the spindle, without whose wear and tear the cotton could not be spun. Hence, in determining the value of the yarn, or the labor time required for its production, all the special processes carried on at various times and in different places which were necessary, first to produce the cotton and the wasted portion of the spindle, and then with the cotton and the spindle to spin the yarn, may together be looked on as different and successive phases of the same labor process. All the labor contained in the yarn is past labor, and it is a matter of no importance that the labor expended to produce its constituent elements lies further back in the past than the labor expended on the final process, the spinning. The former stands, as it were, in the pluperfect, the latter in the perfect tense. But this doesn't matter. If a definite quantity of labor, say 30 days, is needed to build a house, the total amount of labor incorporated in the house is not altered by the fact that the work of the last day was done 29 days later than that of the first. Therefore, the labor contained in the raw material and instruments of labor can be treated just as if it were labor expended in an earlier stage of the spinning process, before the labor finally added in the form of actual spinning. The values of the means of production which are expressed in the price of 12 shillings, the cotton and the spindle, are therefore constituent parts of the value of the yarn, i.e. of the value of the product. 2 conditions must nevertheless be fulfilled. First, the cotton and the spindle must genuinely have served to produce a use value. They must, in the present case, become yarn. Value is independent of the particular use value by which it is born, but a use value of some kind has to act as its bearer. Second, the labor time expended must not exceed what is necessary under the given social conditions of production. Therefore, if no more than 1 pound of cotton is needed to spin 1 pound of yarn, no more than this weight of cotton may be consumed in the production of 1 pound of yarn. The same is true of the spindle. If the capitalist has a foible for using golden spindles instead of steel ones, the only labor that counts for anything in the value of the yarn remains that which would be required to produce a steel spindle, because no more is necessary under the given social conditions. We now know what part of the value of the yarn is formed by the means of production, namely the cotton and the spindle. It is 12 shillings, i.e. the materialization of 2 days' labor. The next point to be considered is what part of the value of the yarn is added to the cotton by the labor of the spinner. We have now to consider this labor from a standpoint quite different from that adopted for the labor process. There, we viewed it solely as the activity which has the purpose of changing cotton into yarn. There, the more appropriate the work was to its purpose, the better the yarn, other circumstances remaining the same. In that case, the labor of the spinner was specifically different from other kinds of productive labor, and this difference revealed itself both subjectively in the particular purpose of spinning and objectively in the special character of its operation, the special nature of its means of production, and the special use value of its product. For the operation of spinning, cotton and spindles are a necessity, but for making rifled cannon they would be of no use whatever. Here, on the contrary, where we consider the labor of the spinner only insofar as it creates value, i.e. is a source of value, that labor differs in no respect from the labor of the man who bores cannon, or what concerns us more closely here, from the labor of the cotton spinner and the spindle maker, which is realized in the means of production of the yarn. It is solely by reason of this identity that cotton planting, spindle making, and spinning are capable of forming the component parts of one whole, namely the value of the yarn, differing only quantitatively from each other. Here we are no longer concerned with the quality, the character, and the content of the labor, but merely with its quantity, and this simply requires to be calculated. We assume that spinning is simple labor, the average labor of a given society. Later it will be seen that the contrary assumption would make no difference. During the labor process, the worker's labor constantly undergoes a transformation from the form of unrest into that of being, from the form of motion into that of objectivity. At the end of 1 hour, the spinning motion is represented in a certain quantity of yarn. In other words, a definite quantity of labor, namely that of 1 hour, has been objectified in the cotton. We say labor, i.e. the expenditure of his vital force by the spinner, and not spinning labor, because the special work of spinning counts here only insofar as it is the expenditure of labor power in general, and not the specific labor of the spinner. In the process we are now considering, it is of extreme importance that no more time be consumed in the work of transforming the cotton into yarn than is necessary under the given social conditions. If, under normal, i.e. average social conditions of production, X pounds of cotton are made into Y pounds of yarn by 1 hour's labor, then a day's labor does not count as 12 hours labor unless 12 times X pounds of cotton have been made into 12 times Y pounds of yarn. For only socially necessary labor time counts towards the creation of value. Not only the labor, but also the raw materials and the product now appear in quite a new light, very different from that in which we viewed them in the labor process pure and simple. Now, the raw material merely serves to absorb a definite quantity of labor. By being soaked in labor, the raw material is in fact changed into yarn, because labor power is expended in the form of spinning and added to it. But the product, the yarn, is now nothing more than a measure of the labor absorbed by the cotton. If in 1 hour, 1 2/3 pounds of cotton can be spun into 1 2/3 pounds of yarn, then 10 pounds of yarn indicate the absorption of 6 hours labor. Definite quantities of product, quantities which are determined by experience, now represent nothing but definite quantities of labor, definite masses of crystallized labor time. They are now simply the material shape taken by a given number of hours or days of social labor. The fact that the labor is precisely the labor of spinning, that its material is cotton, its product yarn, is as irrelevant here as it is that the object of labor is itself already a product, hence already raw material. If the worker, instead of spinning, were to be employed in a coal mine, the object on which he worked would be coal, which is present in nature. Nevertheless, a definite quantity of coal, when extracted from its seam, would represent a definite quantity of absorbed labor. We assumed, on the occasion of its sale, that the value of a day's labor power was 3 shillings, and that 6 hours' labor was incorporated in that sum, and consequently that this amount of labor was needed to produce the worker's average daily means of subsistence. If now our spinner, by working for 1 hour, can convert 1 2/3 pounds of cotton into 1 2/3 pounds of yarn, it follows that in 6 hours he will convert 10 pounds of cotton into 10 pounds of yarn. Hence, during the spinning process, the cotton absorbs 6 hours of labor. The same quantity of labor is also embodied in a piece of gold of the value of 3 shillings. A value of 3 shillings, therefore, is added to the cotton by the labor of spinning. Let us now consider the total value of the product, the 10 pounds of yarn. 2.5 days of labor have been objectified in it. Out of this, 2 days were contained in the cotton and the worn-down portions of the spindle, and half a day was absorbed during the process of spinning. This 2.5 days of labor is represented by a piece of gold of the value of 15 shillings. Hence, 15 shillings is an adequate price for the 10 pounds of yarn, and the price of 1 pound is 1 shilling 6pence. Our capitalist stares in astonishment. The value of the product is equal to the value of the capital advanced. The value advanced has not been valorized. No surplus value has been created, and consequently, money has not been transformed into capital. The price of the yarn is 15 shillings, and 15 shillings were spent in the open market on the constituent elements of the product, or what amounts to the same thing, on the factors of the labor process. 10 shillings were paid for the cotton, 2 shillings for the wear of the spindle, and 3 shillings for the labor power. The swollen value of the yarn is of no avail, for it is merely the sum of the values formerly existing in the cotton, the spindle, and the labor power. Out of such a simple addition of existing values, no surplus value can possibly arise. These values are now all concentrated in one thing, but so they were in the sum of 15 shillings before it was split up into 3 parts by the purchaser of the commodities. In itself, this result is not particularly strange. The value of 1 pound of yarn is 1 shilling 6pence, and our capitalist would therefore have to pay 15 shillings for 10 pounds of yarn on the open market. It's clear that whether a man buys his house ready built or has it built for him, neither of these operations will increase the amount of money laid out on the house. Our capitalist, who is at home in vulgar economics, may perhaps say that he advanced his money with the intention of making more money out of it. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and he might just as well have intended to make money without producing at all. He makes threats. He will not be caught napping again. In the future, he will buy the commodities in the market instead of manufacturing them himself. But if all his brother capitalists were to do the same, where would he find his commodities on the market? And he cannot eat his money. He recites the catechism, "Consider my abstinence. I might have squandered the 15 shillings, but instead I consumed it productively and made yarn with it." Very true, and as a reward he is now in possession of good yarn instead of a bad conscience. As for playing the part of a miser, it would never do for him to relapse into such bad ways. We have already seen what such asceticism leads to. Besides, where there is nothing, the king has lost his rights. Whatever the merits of his abstinence, there is no money to recompense him, because the value of the product is merely the sum of the values thrown into the process of production. Let him therefore console himself with the reflection that virtue is its own reward. But no, on the contrary, he becomes insistent. The yarn is of no use to him, he says. He produced it in order to sell it. In that case, let him sell it, or easier still, let him in future produce only things he needs himself, a remedy already prescribed by his personal physician McCulloch as being of proven efficacy against an epidemic of overproduction. Now our capitalist grows defiant. Can the worker produce commodities out of nothing merely by using his arms and legs? Did I not provide him with the materials through which and in which alone his labor could be embodied? And as the greater part of society consists of such impecunious creatures, have I not rendered society an incalculable service by providing my instruments of production, my cotton, and my spindle, and the worker too? For have I not provided him with the means of subsistence? Am I to be allowed nothing in return for all this service? But has the worker not performed an equivalent service in return, by changing his cotton and his spindle into yarn? In any case, here the question of service does not arise. A service is nothing other than the useful effect of a use value, be it that of a commodity or that of the labor. But here we are dealing with exchange value. The capitalist paid to the worker a value of 3 shillings, and the worker gave him back an exact equivalent in the value of 3 shillings he added to the cotton. He gave him value for value. Our friend, who has up till now displayed all the arrogance of capital, suddenly takes on the unassuming demeanor of one of his own workers, and exclaims, "Have I not myself worked? Have I not performed the labor of superintendence, of overseeing the spinner? And does not this labor too create value?" The capitalist's own overseer and manager shrug their shoulders. In the meantime, with a hearty laugh, he recovers his composure. The whole litany he's just recited was simply meant to pull the wool over our eyes. He himself does not care twopence for it. He leaves this and all similar subterfuges and conjuring tricks to the professors of political economy, who are paid for it. He himself is a practical man, and although he does not always consider what he says outside his business, within his business, he knows what he's doing. Let us examine the matter more closely. The value of a day's labor power amounts to 3 shillings, because, on our assumption, half a day's labor is objectified in that quantity of labor power, i.e. because the means of subsistence required every day for the production of labor power cost half a day's labor. But the past labor embodied in the labor power, and the living labor it can perform, and the daily cost of maintaining labor power and its daily expenditure in work are two totally different things. The former determines the exchange value of the labor power, the latter its use value. The fact that half a day's labor is necessary to keep the worker alive during 24 hours does not in any way prevent him from working a whole day. Therefore, the value of labor power and the value which that labor power valorizes in the labor process are two entirely different magnitudes, and this difference was what the capitalist had in mind when he was purchasing the labor power. The useful quality of labor power, by virtue of which it makes yarn or boots, was to the capitalist merely the necessary condition for his activity. For in order to create value, labor must be expended in a useful manner. What was really decisive for him was the specific use value which this commodity possesses, of being a source not only of value, but of more value than it has itself. This is the specific service the capitalist expects from labor power, and in this transaction he acts in accordance with the eternal laws of commodity exchange. In fact, the seller of labor power, like the seller of any other commodity, realizes its exchange value and alienates its use value. He cannot take the one without giving the other. The use value of labor power, in other words labor, belongs just as little to its seller as the use value of oil, after it has been sold, belongs to the dealer who sold it. The owner of the money has paid the value of a day's labor power. He therefore has use of it for a day. A day's labor belongs to him. On the one hand, the daily sustenance of labor power costs only half a day's labor, while on the other hand, the very same labor power can remain effective, can work, during a whole day, and consequently the value which its use during one day creates is double what the capitalist pays for that use. This circumstance is a piece of good luck for the buyer, but by no means an injustice towards the seller. Our capitalist foresaw this situation, and that was the cause of his laughter. The worker therefore finds in the workshop the means of production necessary for working not just 6, but 12 hours. If 10 pounds of cotton could absorb 6 hours labor and become 10 pounds of yarn, now 20 pounds of cotton will absorb 12 hours labor and be changed into 20 pounds of yarn. Let us examine the product of this extended labor process. Now, 5 days of labor are objectified in this 20 pounds of yarn. 4 days are due to the cotton and the lost steel of the spindle. The remaining day has been absorbed by the cotton during the spinning process. Expressed in gold, the labor of 5 days is 30 shillings. This is therefore the price of the 20 pounds of yarn, giving as before 1 shilling 6pence as the price of 1 pound. But the sum of the values of the commodities thrown into the process amounts to 27 shillings. The value of the yarn is 30 shillings. Therefore, the value of the product is 1/9 greater than the value advanced to produce it. 27 shillings have been turned into 30 shillings. A surplus value of 3 shillings has been precipitated. The trick has at last worked. Money has been transformed into capital. Every condition of the problem is satisfied, while the laws governing the exchange of commodities have not been violated in any way. Equivalent has been exchanged for equivalent. For the capitalist as buyer paid the full value for each commodity, for the cotton, for the spindle, and for the labor power. He then did what is done by every purchaser of commodities. He consumed their use value. The process of consuming labor power, which was also the process of producing commodities, resulted in 20 pounds of yarn, with a value of 30 shillings. The capitalist, formerly a buyer, now returns to the market as a seller. He sells his yarn at 1 shilling 6pence a pound, which is its exact value. Yet for all that, he withdraws 3 shillings more from circulation than he originally threw into it. This whole course of events, the transformation of money into capital, both takes place and does not take place in the sphere of circulation. It takes place through the mediation of circulation because it is conditioned by the purchase of the labor power in the market. It does not take place in circulation because what happens there is only an introduction to the valorization process, which is entirely confined to the sphere of production. And so, everything is for the best, in the best of all possible worlds. By turning his money into commodities, which serve as the building materials for a new product and as factors in the labor process, by incorporating living labor into their lifeless objectivity, the capitalist simultaneously transforms value, i.e. past labor in its objectified and lifeless form, into capital, value which can perform its own valorization process, an animated monster which can begin to work, as if its body were by love possessed. If we now compare the process of creating value with the process of valorization, we see that the latter is nothing but the continuation of the former beyond a definite point. If the process is not carried out beyond the point where the value paid by the capitalist for the labor power is replaced by an exact equivalent, it is simply a process of creating value. But if it is continued beyond that point, it becomes a process of valorization. If we proceed further and compare the process of creating value with the labor process, we find that the latter consists in useful labor, which produces use values. Here, the movement of production is viewed qualitatively with regard to the particular kind of article produced and in accordance with the purpose and content of the movement. But if it is viewed as a value-creating process, the same labor process appears only quantitatively. Here, it is a question merely of the time needed to do the work, of the period, that is, during which the labor power is usefully expended. Here, the commodities which enter into the labor process no longer count as functionally determined and material elements on which labor power acts with a given purpose. They count merely as definite quantities of objectified labor. Whether it was already contained in the means of production or has just been added by the action of labor power, that labor counts only according to its duration. It amounts to so many hours, days, etc. Moreover, the time spent in production counts only insofar as it is socially necessary for the production of a use value. This has various consequences. First, the labor power must be functioning under normal conditions. If a self-acting mule is the socially predominant instrument of labor for spinning, it would be impermissible to supply the spinner with a spinning wheel. The cotton, too, must not be such trash as to tear at every other moment, but must be of suitable quality. Otherwise, the spinner would spend more time than socially necessary in producing his pound of yarn, and in this case the excess of time would create neither value nor money. But whether the objective factors of labor are normal or not does not depend on the worker, but rather on the capitalist. A further condition is that the labor power itself must be of normal effectiveness. In the trade in which it is being employed, it must possess the average skill, dexterity, and speed prevalent in that trade, and our capitalist took good care to buy labor power of such normal quality. It must be expended with the average amount of exertion and the usual degree of intensity, and the capitalist is as careful to see that this is done as he is to ensure that his workmen are not idle for a single moment. He has bought the use of the labor power for a definite period, and he insists on his rights. He has no intention of being robbed. Lastly, and for this purpose our friend has a penal code of his own, all wasteful consumption of raw material or instruments of labor is strictly forbidden, because what is wasted in this way represents a superfluous expenditure of quantities of objectified labor, labor that does not count in the product or enter into its value. We now see that the difference between labor considered on the one hand as producing utilities and on the other hand as creating value, a difference which we discovered by our analysis of a commodity, resolves itself into a distinction between two aspects of the production process. The production process, considered as the unity of the labor process and the process of creating value, is the process of production of commodities. Considered as the unity of the labor process and the process of valorization, it is the capitalist process of production, or the capitalist form of the production of commodities. We stated on a previous page that in the valorization process, it does not in the least matter whether the labor appropriated by the capitalist is simple labor of average social quality or more complex labor, labor with a higher specific gravity, as it were. All labor of a higher or more complicated character than average labor is expenditure of labor power of a more costly kind. Labor power whose production has cost more time and labor than unskilled or simple labor power, and which therefore has a higher value. This power being of a higher value, it expresses itself in labor of a higher sort, and therefore becomes objectified during an equal amount of time in proportionally higher values. Whatever difference in skill there may be between the labor of a spinner and that of a jeweler, the portion of his labor by which the jeweler merely replaces the value of his own labor power does not in any way differ in quality from the additional portion by which he creates surplus value. In both cases, the surplus value results only from a quantitative excess of labor, from a lengthening of one and the same labor process. In the one case, the production of making jewels, in the other, the process of making yarn. But on the other hand, in every process of creating value, the reduction of the higher type of labor to average social labor, for instance 1 day of the former to X days of the latter, is unavoidable. We therefore save ourselves a superfluous operation and simplify our analysis by the assumption that the labor of the worker employed by the capitalist is average simple labor,